Welcome, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I know that a few people are still trickling in, but I want to make sure that we leave as much time as possible for the discussion itself. So I am delighted to welcome you all for joining us today for Bridging the Urban-Rural Divide, which is the final conversation in our Democratic Spaces series for this spring. And I especially want to thank our wonderful panelists for spending your lunchtime with us today and also helping to lead this important discussion. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Hari Hahn. I'm the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute. We are an academic and public forum at Johns Hopkins University that is dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as a cornerstone of global democracy. We launched the series Democratic Spaces this spring to explore how we can cultivate spaces, both real and virtual, that enable the kind of robust participation in democracy that we need. A healthy democracy, as we all know, requires that all of us, no matter our identities, affiliations, beliefs, or creeds, play a role as members in civil society. With this series, we have been exploring how we can build the spaces that invite all voices, especially of those who currently face barriers, into those conversations. Today's panel will be a discussion of how citizens of what's often been described as two Americas, rural and urban, can come together across geographic, political, and racial divides to find common cause and mutual respect, and to begin to find solutions for the economic, health, and other problems so many Americans are facing. We're really happy to be co-hosting this event with Urban Rural Action. More on them in just a moment. So I'm excited to introduce today's guests who will really be leading the discussion today. And I think everyone has their camera on already, which is great. So I'll start with Summer Ali, who is a research professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University. She is a founding president and CEO of Millions of Conversations, a media-driven campaign designed to bring Americans together by promoting positivity and inclusion to transcend cultural critical divides. She also co-chairs a Vanderbilt project on unity and American democracy. Welcome, Summer. It's wonderful to have Dee Davis with us. Dee is the founder and president of the Center for Rural Strategies, which seeks to improve economic and social conditions for communities in the countryside and around the world through the creative and innovative use of media and communications. Dee has helped design and lead national public information campaigns on topics as diverse as commercial television programming and federal banking policy. Welcome, Dee. Christiana McFarland is the research director at the National League of Cities, the largest and oldest organization representing America's cities and their leaders. She leads the NLC's efforts to transform city-level data into information that strengthens the capacity of city leaders and raises the awareness of challenges, trends, and successes in cities. Welcome, Christy. We're delighted to have you with us today. And finally, our moderator for today's conversation is Joe Bubman. He is the founder and executive director of UrbanRural Action, an organization that brings Americans together across geographic, political, racial, and other divides to build relationships, strengthen collaboration skills, explore different perspectives, and work together to address challenges that impact all communities. Urban Rural Action and SNF Agora are partnering this year on an initiative called Uniting for Action on the Maryland Economy. And we'll tell you more about that opportunity at the end of the session today. So the discussion today is going to be about 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Please submit your questions anytime during the discussion using the Q&A function. Joe will be choosing questions to pose live to the panelists. So thank you again for joining us. And Joe, I'll turn the conversation over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Hari, and thanks to you and to SNF Agora for hosting this timely and important discussion on the urban-rural divide. The purposes of our discussion today are to define and diagnose an urban-rural divide and to highlight commonalities that exist across urban and rural communities to showcase approaches that work for transcending urban and rural differences and identify steps we can all take to improve perceptions of urban and rural communities. Before we jump in, I just want to offer a couple notes about urban and rural. There are lots of classifications of urban and rural with significant implications for policy. For our purposes, urban and rural are meant to communicate different ends of a spectrum of different community types. The challenge is that urban and rural don't adequately convey the range of differences across urban and across rural. So I would propose that we be cautious about the generalizations we make about urban America and rural America. And I just want to say one more word about the quote unquote divide. It's true that there are real differences between urban and rural communities. There are different levels of racial, religious, and ethnic diversity, different levels of foreign-born residents, different political leanings. I also think we shouldn't exaggerate those differences. We don't live in completely different Americas. After all, the issues that impact our country, whether it's healthcare access, educational inequities, economic recovery, mass incarceration, impact all communities, urban and rural alike. And differences need not be divides, right? Differences, after all, are a source of strength in our country. So with that, I am thrilled to be with our terrific panel today. And just to say a word about the flow for the session, the first round of questions will focus a bit on the challenges and the differences across urban and rural communities. And the second round of questions will be more oriented towards solutions and how we can transcend differences. As Hari mentioned, please do submit questions and comments. Would love to engage with you all and pose your questions to our panelists. So without further ado, Summer, let me turn to you first and ask you, what do you see as the urban-rural divide, and why is it so important to discuss?
Well, thank you, Joe, and thank you, all of you, for joining us today. And I would say we've been watching this divide grow, arguably over the past 25 years, so a quarter of a century. And I also just wanted to put it into context because in the introductory remarks, we talked about how the focus here is on global democracy. And I would say that this tension between urban, rural communities is not US specific. It's something we're seeing the world over. We're seeing this across Africa. We're seeing this across Europe. We're seeing this across the Middle East, South America, Latin America, etc. So what is it actually that is actually the common thread globally that we're seeing create this tension? I think it's a couple of different things. And I think if we wanted to just sort of like just put a covering on it, we'd say it's the fourth industrial revolution, which is how we are seeing just this rapid pace of the role that technology and machines are playing in our society today, from jobs to learning, to how we communicate, to how we engage, to how we see ourselves, to how we view what's real, what's not real. We have terms like alternative reality now, and so this is just so much going on at one time that we've just created this tension. And we're grappling to figure out how do we exist in this space. It's almost as if it's a hybrid society with man and machine. And so here we are, and I would also say there are a lot of other factors at play too. For the first time in U.S. history, America is becoming a minority-majority society. We have kicked a couple of things, not just a couple of things, very deep wounds down the road that we have never properly addressed. And I think that this is now also bubbling to the surface. And then I would just add infrastructure too. And I don't think that our infrastructure has properly been updated in half a century at least. And this is furthering that divide too, because the connectivity is off. And it's also contributing to the fact that rural America is still in a great recession, hasn't pulled out of the recession from 10 years ago. And then finally, just one more point, and that is, if you want to think about America, yes, we are one country that is composed of 50 states, but I go one step further when we talk about this, particularly in this discussion. We are 3,142 counties, the majority of which are rural.
I love that kickoff, Summer, and thanks so much for drawing the connections between the urban-rural divide in the United States and across the globe, as well as the significant changes that are impacting urban and rural communities alike, as well as the connectivity challenge that can further the divide. We did have a question come in that I think connects with what you just said, and I'd like to pose it to you before we turn to Christy. and perhaps this will serve as positive reinforcement for others who are thinking about questions and might want to chime in. The question from Christian is it urban versus rural, and is it liberal versus conservative, responsible versus victim, agnostic versus religious, educated versus non-educated? And is the distinction label of urban versus rural already an urban label?
Well, I think actually what's interesting is that many people I speak to in rural communities and rural counties actually talk about this themselves. And so they'll frame it as such, and they'll say they think the framing is, many people I've spoken to, is the framing is accurate. So that's one. Then two, I would say it depends on what issue we're talking about as to the framing.
Yeah, good. Thanks so much, Summer. Christy, let's turn to you next. Some of the data that I've thought a lot about over the past couple of years that sort of shaped my thinking on this question is from the Pew Research Center. And one of the data points from a study that we'll see dropped into the chat momentarily is that 65% of people who live in urban areas believe that people who live in suburbs or rural areas don't understand the challenges facing cities and the people who live in them. And so my question for you, Christy, and the National League of Cities is, what is it that people who live outside of cities misunderstand about cities and the people who live in them?
Thanks, Joe. Great to be here. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. My sense is that there are a lot of sort of common threads to be pulled, both with Samar was discussing in terms of connectivity, as well as what you were talking about in the introduction around differences as a strength, right? So, you know, I think people in cities are very proud of their location, and it's not just a matter of where people live and work, but it really is about self-identity. And I think people in rural communities probably feel the same way very strongly. So I don't necessarily think that there is I don't necessarily think that there's a specific approach that's specific to sort of urban dwellers about what the perspective is on urban. Because when you start talking about it, all of the same things go for rural, right? So when we say things like cities house the world's greatest cultural institutions, we know that rural communities as well offer such a diversity of cultural aspects as well as engagement with nature and so forth. So there are so many similarities in terms of when we actually start talking about what people value about their place. They tend to think of it as urban and rural, but when they start talking, it's like, oh yes, but my place is like that too. You know, I think one aspect of this that I think is critical, and from the perspective of the National League of Cities and how we've been approaching issues around the urban-rural divide, really is taking a deeper dive at regional economies. Now we know sort of a core source, like Samar was talking about, of the urban-rural divide really is the sort of the ascendance of very powerful, tightly concentrated urban activity in urban places. And that tends to be a full narrative about what the urban-rural divide looks like, which is urban technology centers, innovation centers, the haves, and the rest of communities as deteriorating with, you know, with resources being drawn from those places to urban cores, like and leaving those places with very little. In some cases, of course, that narrative runs true, and there certainly are sort of tech hubs that are extremely powerful in terms of driving our economy. But when we peel back that narrative and actually look at the data, and this will be research that we release next month with the Rural Communities Assistance Partnership, what we find is economies are more often defined by integration amongst urban and rural places. Take for example, the Sacramento region. We know that you know that food is driving what is happening in that part of the region. There's agriculture in rural part. There's food processing that's happening in the urban center. The two, urban and rural, need each other in order for that industry to thrive in the region. And we see that time and time and time again throughout the country. So I think it's a matter of storytelling and being able to communicate that that not only do urban and rural places share a lot of the same challenges, Joe, like you had mentioned at the start, whether that it's connectivity related to internet access, whether it's poverty, poor health access, affordable housing, quality housing, the list goes on. But that there are also very significant and strong economic interdependencies between urban and rural that really can help be a conversation starter for urban and rural leaders.
Thanks so much, Christy, for those insights. What I gleaned from what you just shared is that there is this symbiotic relationship between urban and rural. These are interconnected economies, and urban and rural share a lot of the same challenges. We have so much pride in where we live that we may assume that people outside of where we live don't fully appreciate both the strengths and the challenges of our communities. But as you say, through conversation and through a new narrative, and maybe we'll talk more from Summer's perspective and millions of conversations about that as we go forward, through narratives, new narratives, we can gain a better appreciation of how both the challenges and the opportunities across urban and rural are more similar than we might otherwise understand. Dee, let me turn to you next, and I'm going to ask you a question similar to the one I posed to Christy, because as Christy discerns, folks in rural communities have a similar perspective, according to the Pew Research Center, on this question of whether folks outside of rural communities and suburbs and cities understand the challenges that they face. And indeed, 70% of rural residents say that folks outside of rural areas don't fully understand or appreciate the challenges that rural communities face. So what is it from your and the Center for Rural Strategies perspective that folks outside of rural areas misunderstand or don't fully get about rural communities and the people who live in them?
Thanks, Joe. When Rural Strategies was starting, one of the things we were doing, we started rolling out some data on perceptions of rural that Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner did. And I remember presenting to a group, and a couple of data points were that people in rural areas thought that people in urban areas were prejudiced or looked down on them, and people in urban areas thought people in rural areas were prejudiced or looked down on them. And some guy in the back of the room yelled, and both of them got it about right. And I think in some ways, the reality is everybody in this country thinks somebody's looking down on them, no matter what ethnicity, what geography, what income group you're in. Billionaires, CEOs think that somebody's looking down on them. So, I mean, the way so there are things that are working, there are cultural things that work. And just to follow up on Summer's point, if you think about the world's population, up to about 10 years ago, it was half rural. And in that half that was rural, that's where most of the poverty is. That's where a lot of underdevelopment is. And so the strategies for moving people out of poverty towards prosperity have often been having to do with density. Move people into cities. If you're in Kenya or Burkina Faso or Pakistan or China or India, the strategy that's worked is moving people into densely populated areas, and there are cultural costs that go with that. If you think of the United States, right, about 100 years ago, we were at this place of half rural. Now we're at, less than 20% rural, around 20% in central cities and 60% in suburbs. So you're 80% or more metropolitan. You can look at it and say, well, look, these people in the central cities and rural areas are similar in terms of poverty, disenfranchisement, even in terms of broadband penetration, but they vote differently, and there are these cultural divides. So in a way, we look at these differences and these perceptions of differences, and we forget, that most of the 20th century, it was the New Deal coalition was urban and rural that that pushed the country forward. It's only been in the last, Bill Clinton won rural America. So, it's only been in this last 20 to 25 years that we've seen this cultural divide that we assume, we kind of think is going to be forever and has been forever. But there's a reason to think it through different.
Thanks so much, Dee, for laying out some of that trajectory and how some of the demographics have changed in recent history. I would like to throw one question back at you that comes from Tamara. And the question is, I have observed a rural belief that city dwellers choose to live in a city and therefore shouldn't complain about city issues, and that if a city dweller does not like city life, they should move out. Linked to this, I think, is a rural belief that cities necessarily come with many unchangeable negative characteristics for its residents. Is this something that you've seen more widely in your experience living and working in rural communities, Dee?
I think people move back and forth between cities and country all the time. I think a lot of urban people, their dream is to have a place in the country or to take vacations at the shore. And a lot of people in rural areas love to go to the cities. I think that what we don't have is a good common purpose, common prayer, where we come together. What I would say, I live in a community that's red, where my county's 3-to-1 Democrat and voted 4-to-1 for Trump. This is a phenomenon, that we don't see. But the one thing that I would say Trump did smartly was he lifted up the stories of rural experience, right? He didn't say we got to teach these people how to code, these poor, pitiful people. Nobody thought that he was going to bring farming back or coal mining back or timbering back or open the plant that closed down the road. But he lifted up the story so that people in rural areas were important to the country, that they were helping out people in the cities, that they had a role of, whether it was supplying energy or supplying food, that the narrative was lifted up. And I think in some ways that the remedy and what's missing is this common story where urban and rural are pulling on the same rope.
Yeah. Oops, sorry.
Go ahead, Christy.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Dee, I think that's really interesting because you had also mentioned sort of when we think about sort of what is and I know we'll talk about solutions in just a minute, Joe, but sort of what is the answer to some of this? It had been, oh, well, folks from rural should move to the cities where there are opportunities. And it just sort of goes back to the not necessarily respecting where people sort of are coming from, either culturally or sort of the contributions that their place can make to sort of the broader region or country as a whole, right? So thinking about, again, strategies and how we sort of value places and people for what they are and honoring that, and thinking about how we then start that conversations from that place, as opposed to it should be this way or it should be that way.
And I just wanted to add one thing, is there's something that you said too. It's called pride. Pride in one's identity.
Yeah, pride and mutual respect and common purpose and lifting up stories. And as you said, Dee, ensuring that people in rural communities are recognized for the value that they deliver to the country as a whole. This ties in with one of the questions that an attendee, Peter, has submitted, and I want you to just build on this before we move to solutions more fully. The question is, one of the supposed old bonds between urban and rural populations one hears about was alleged membership in a common imagined community. Maybe we never met each other, the argument goes, but we imagined ourselves as interdependent and part of one great social canvas communicated in common media, films, novels. Has that gone away with the fractured nature of digital media? Can it be recovered, built in a new way, or is the only hope to manage the decline of a common imagination and smooth the edges of disintegration? Anyone want to weigh in with reactions to that question? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, though, I think absolutely this hasn't gone away, because it's at the heart of being human. What is being human? Being human is also is this search for belonging. It's this want to belong. Belong where? In your community. How do you define your community? And I think that people could define that in different ways, but they are searching for belonging in their respective communities. And I think if you think about the public square, you could think about, even though right now it doesn't seem that way, doesn't feel that way, social media can be thought of as the public square. And how are we using that public square? Right now, in many ways, it seems as if everyone's screaming in the public square, right? For different reasons. They're screaming in that public square, and people are using the public square to manipulate. We know that. There's so many different factors in so many different ways. And we know that the digitization of fear at lightning speed through the internet is working right now to scare everyone in the public square. But what if digitization of empathy works too? And I think that we need to test some of this, and that's what we're hoping to do, and to bring people together, because arguably at the end of the day, most people do want peace. They do want to find that. They are searching for that, and that's where they find that belonging, if you will. And what we're seeing right now is what we call, in mediation terms, an authorizing environment for cruelty. We're seeing people be brutal to each other. We're seeing a lack of mercy. We're seeing a lack of forgiveness. We're seeing all of these different things. And we're seeing systematic problems being blamed at the individual. And I think that there is responsibility and accountability for individuals to hold, and we could talk about that at some point. But I also think we need to be thinking about what is the systemic answer, which we're going to get into, and what is the individual answer, and how do we disrupt these cycles that are authorizing for cruelty, and instead replace them with a place of sense of purpose, to go back to Dee's point, of where people feel and imagine themselves in a shared future rooted in community, which I don't think is lost.
Go ahead.
I'm kind of co-sign with Summer said. If you look at these last 20, 25 years, one of the real changes in rural life has been where we get our information and get our news. And so up until at that point, there were still regional papers, there were still rural reporters that were coming into the area every day. And there was still like local radio news. And what we've seen in the past, as media consolidation has brought newspapers back into their metropolitan hubs, where the audiences are more well-heeled. And broadcasters have gone to satellite or gone to distant news. There were gaps in rural areas that were really filled by a lot of entrepreneurial Christian radio stations, particularly little stations. The second largest format after country music are these little country stations that come everywhere, and they play music, and they sometimes ask for money, and then they have rip and read news on the hour that's very weaponized, that's nationalized, not about local. And in the gaps that were that appeared when other kinds of news and information vanished was this weaponized news. And if you think about what we come to believe, as I think the four, like what we see first, what we see most, what we get from a reliable source, and that which we get without any refutation. And I think in some ways that going hand in hand to this meanness that we see in the digital world is the lack of other news sources. And it happened incrementally, but it's real now.
So there's so much rich conversation happening here. I want to sort of move us to a solutions-oriented conversation, but I want to pick up on what Dee, you and Summer said, and then go to Christy. Dee, you just talked about sort of news deserts in a sense. You talked about the weaponization of information. Do you want to say a word about Daily Yonder And you had talked previously about sort of building up a common purpose, elevating stories of rural America. How do you see the Daily Yonder contributing to finding common purpose across urban and rural?
Well, I mean, Daily Yonder is ours, and we did it. We started publishing the Daily Yonder because we had some certain frustration in trying to influence other news outlets, and so we thought, well, we could create this digital platform and make it serve a broad rural. You know, newspapers usually deal with one media market, one area, one place, and so you know, we like it. We think we're doing a good job, but you know, there are ups and downs. It's not like you know, it's just part of trying to find this this kind of common song we can all you know, hum once in a while, and that, you know, that's part of what we hope is the solution. I mean, the same way we work with the Rural Assembly, you know, we try to find common policy, but rural's big, it's diverse. You know, there's 60 million people. Not everybody is gonna find what you're doing and or like it, but you know, it's our it's our story.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Summer, you talked about how most people want to live in peace. Most people want to coexist. So this is in fact true of violent conflict contexts around the world, where even there, a majority of people are not taking up arms. They want to take care of their families. They want to contribute to the development of their community and so on. Let's talk a little bit about millions of conversations, because as you said, right now, people are screaming into the public square of social media, and you think there's an opportunity for a reframe. I do want to acknowledge a question that has come in, which is, can we really frame and address this issue without also identifying the difference between rural areas that are majority people of color versus majority white rural areas? So Summer, can you tell us a little bit about, sort of at the grassroots level, how is Millions of Conversations working to transcend urban and rural differences, including the types of sort of racial and demographic differences that Cynthia mentions, and what are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve through your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will just say this. So thanks for the question. You can't have a conversation about a common purpose and shared future and how we walk together as one country without a conversation on race. So I fully believe that. And I don't think it's only a separate conversation. I think it's a conversation that needs to intersect with almost everything we're talking about here. And I think we need to actually get comfortable with the uncomfortable and be able to be well versed in having these conversations. These are, for some people, very difficult conversations, very painful conversations for a whole variety of factors, depending on who's having the conversation, depending on the way the conversation is being had. But that said, it's not a conversation we can afford to ignore. And it affects everybody. Every single person for so many reasons, including the fact that we're all a part of the system. And if this system is doing wrong, is doing wrong to an entire group of people, it affects all of us because it's being also done in our name. And so I think there's so much there. And I'll also just say this, it's interesting. I did an interview recently with someone in South Africa who asked me about why I always brought up my time in South Africa and what I learned. And one of the things I said that really struck me is that in South Africa, there's a lot of things that haven't gone right, but there's a lot of things that have. And one of the things I found refreshing is that you can have very open and honest conversations about race in South Africa in ways that you can't yet here in the United States. And I hope we can get there, because we need to get there. And I think the only way we're going to do it is by talking about it. And so it's Millions of Conversations, we've developed a 7-step process to get to sustainable peace and what some people call unity. So some people are calling for unity. I often say that's great. There's a process of how we get there. You can say, I'd like to get there. That's where I want that's the destination I want to get to. But we're not there yet. And it's going to take some work for us to get there. So what does that roadmap actually look like? So we've designed that at Millions of Conversations. I'll take you guys through it in just a minute, but to say that 7-step process is the positive norm setting process that we believe will disrupt the negative norm setting cycle that I just described earlier, which creates that authorizing environment for cruelty, which starts with the demonization of the other, which is done through disinformation, misinformation, blaming groups of people, targeting groups of people, with otherizing them, politicizing them, with demonizing messages. That's the first step in that negative norm setting cycle. That's where it starts, which then leads to blaming the other, which then creates animosity, which builds on fear, which leads to anger, in some instances hate, and then violence. That's what we're seeing happen right now. At Millions of Conversations, we're disrupting that by starting from the very beginning of how you view the other, how you view your neighbor, how you view your community member, and digitally through digital media and also in person. Now, I'm going to take the 7 steps real quick, Joe, and then I'll stop. But the 7 steps starts with listening to the other, with agreeing to ground rules. I'm going to respect your humanity. Okay, so listening. Second step is humanization. Third step in that process is empathy. That's what I was talking about, the digitization of empathy, which is really important. And then you have a 4th step was exploration of common values. The 5th step is a commitment to a shared future. I see myself in your future and vice versa. And then we get to truth and reconciliation, which is we've had a past that we need to talk about before we can work on that future. And then once we've done that, we realize sustainable peace.
Summer, thanks so much for laying out those 7 steps. And one of the things that it reminds me of, which is a little bit different, is that through listening and building relationships and respecting the other, you can work together on the substantive issues that impact all communities. And by working on these substantive issues of healthcare and economic hardship and mass incarceration and food insecurity, you can build relationships with the other. And so I'm wondering, Christy, when in the context of the National League of Cities and the work that you've done to advance policies for local programs related to public safety, infrastructure, transportation, sustainability, those of course are issues, as we've heard from Summer and Dee, that impact rural communities as well. And you've talked about the interconnectedness of urban and rural and regional economies. So the question is, how can policymakers better address such issues with approaches that are responsive to the unique needs of different types of communities, both urban and rural?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, just first a comment, I think on Summer's approach, that was fantastic, the way that you laid that out. Just reflecting on sort of the question before that about race, and obviously there's extensive intersectionality between race and urban rural issues, but even thinking about how much we've advanced, I think, on how we talk about race and then what the corollaries are for how we talk about urban and rural. So I hope we can come back to that, because that was really great. Thank you. Getting back specifically to sort of decision making, I think around a lot of challenges around public safety, infrastructure, transportation, sustainability. I didn't think of it just until I was sort of reviewing my notes about this question in particular and what I wanted to say about it. But it really is. Oftentimes, I think urban and rural communities can come together to sort of fight a common enemy. And in this case, and often when it comes to decision making, we know that that states, not saying states are the enemy, but state governments often dictate very specifically how local communities can address their local problems. And what we've been seeing actually over the past 3 decades or so is increasingly, in some places, not every place, but in many states across the country, there is an increasing restriction on the types of policies and programs that local communities can implement. Oftentimes, they're targeted at urban centers and cities, but it's a statewide policy, which means it also affects rural communities. So we know that there are unique needs for urban and rural communities, but that's exactly why we advocate for greater local decision making. So in our opinion, state policymakers must include the voice and the input of local leaders and community members to reimagine public safety, update infrastructure, enhance sustainability, because each community does have different needs and different approaches. So at NLC, we've introduced a framework to make that happen. We call it the Principles of Home Rule for the 21st Century. Home rule obviously is a very specific sort of legal doctrine at the state level that affects how sort of the types of local authority that cities have and towns and all local governments, municipalities have within their states. We looked at this issue over half a century ago. We revisited it more recently to update and reflect the powers that localities need for their communities today and years to come. And the new vision of home rule gives language to states to adopt to ensure that cities, towns, and villages are protected in the state constitutions and in their laws. And by having these principles, states can ensure that local governments in particular, whether they're urban or they're rural, the role of states in this circumstance really is to make sure that communities are meeting the minimum standards of health, safety, and economic prosperity. But above that, cities and towns should be able to meet communities where they are in terms of their own values and setting standards above potentially what the state may be interested in terms of requiring and providing that flexibility from a governing standpoint so that the values of communities can be properly reflected. What we've seen over the past several decades, as I mentioned, particularly in the last decade, states have not necessarily adopted an approach that is giving greater authority to local governments. They've done just the opposite. There's extensive limitations on communities by way of preemption, which is sort of different types of state policies that limit the authority of local governments. And we've seen this on a wide range of issues, from housing and wages to sustainability and discrimination. And with COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen this only get worse in a lot of places as states restricted what cities can do to protect their residents. So, we saw, just over, the last 6 months, states like Ohio banning mask mandates in cities, towns, and schools. So even if a state sort of has a general mandate, for example, thinking about what cities and towns are able to do in their own communities. We know Texas has done something similar. Missouri is looking for ways to regulate how communities now can spend the funding that they're receiving from the American Rescue Plan. So these things are concerning because we know that there are innovations, both in terms of policies and programs at the local level that require the flexibility from the state government, right? And partnership more so than anything, really. But we know that COVID-19 also provided opportunities to highlight local and state relationships that do work. So we know governors in North Carolina and Maryland, who both enacted COVID-19 regulations, also explicitly wrote into their executive orders that localities can enact, more stringent restrictions, for example, or operate on longer timelines, just recognizing that there are differences from place to place, city to city, town to town. And so that we know that these actions obviously affect all of our communities. Another sort of, I would say, huge example of all of this really is around municipal broadband, and knowing that certainly affects rural communities at extremely high rates, and the ability for municipalities to extend broadband networks is critically important for connectivity for those communities in particular, but affects all communities, urban and rural, within the states that limit that authority.
Thanks, Christy. So Dee, you just heard from Christy talk about the importance of local governance, talk about home rule. In some of your actions work with urban and rural communities, we often hear about a sense from rural residents that their state government neglects their concerns, doesn't invest as much as they should in rural communities. I'm wondering what your take is on that, particularly in the context of the pandemic, and what you think policymakers should be doing to address the unique needs of rural and urban communities alike.
So for a long time, investment in capacity, you could say infrastructure, has been in suburban areas, right? We know how urban is going to vote. We know how rural is going to vote. That what's in play are the suburbs, right? Trump won in 2016 by winning the suburbs. Biden won 2020 by winning the suburbs. So a lot of the investment in capacity in kind of an economic future has been in these suburban areas. Not that there's anything terribly wrong with it, but there's a frustration that comes in both urban and rural areas in terms of feeling left out, feeling like that they're low priority. But also, I would just like to say one more thing following what said about race, because I think sometimes when we hear somebody talk about urban-rural divide, we really immediately go, it's code for a racial divide. And I think that it's not true or it's not important to deal with, but I think 30% of the American electorate is diverse. It's a little apples to oranges, but 22% of rural America is diverse. It's not a monolith. And I think in some ways that we miss opportunities to heal the rift if we don't think about how race plays out in these communities and how integral it is to rural life as well. I know a year ago, after the George Floyd incident, all these little towns up and down this ridge, most of them 95% white, they all had different actions where people came to town. I live in a town of 1,500. I went down, there were 200 people at the courthouse, and they gathered together, they made speeches, and all of a sudden people were yelling, George Floyd, say his name, or mama, mama, I can't breathe. And they marched through town. And these are people, I know them. They're not 10 of them have ever been to Minneapolis, yet it was critical to who they were to take that moment, to have the agency to speak out for this. And I think in some ways that's part of the rural experience that's easy to miss.
Thanks so much, Dee. So let me turn to a couple questions from our audience, and then we will close by identifying some action steps that folks who are listening in can take. So one question is, interesting that pride came up. Is pride a relational concept? If liberals frown upon rurals, they will feel antagonistic. And then somebody like Donald Trump comes and, authentic or not, appreciates rurals, those who feel left behind. Maybe that is the essence of modern populistic politics, to give people back their pride. And there are some examples of different leaders around the world. Any reactions to that comment and question? Summer, go ahead.
I don't think anybody gives somebody pride. So I think it's something that people just respect. And I oftentimes say, let's be careful not to humiliate. Let's encourage humility, but not humiliation. So I think tone and approach is really important. And seeing each other's humanity. And whether we like it or not, as human beings, we feel pride. We feel proud of something. Like when you have a baby, somebody like, you must be so proud of her. Your parents must be so proud of you. People will say those things. What does that mean when somebody says it? It's this feeling that you have. And I think people want to feel pride in who they are and in their identity. And what we have to do is make sure that that pride is always rooted in a place of where it doesn't take somebody else's humanity away. It's not at the expense of that. So yeah.
Summer, I really appreciate that sentiment, and maybe just making the connection from that question, which was about populists and leaders trying to win votes through recognizing or elevating people's pride, to the work that you do, right? You laid out 7 steps of moving towards sustainable peace. What does it look like in practice to appreciate others' humanity?
Absolutely. I think in part it's actually not allowing for entrepreneurial politicians to manipulate people. So going directly to people and speaking from citizen to citizen rather than a mouthpiece through a politician. Because what's happening is they're being very opportunistic, and we see that. But that's why I think it's power in the people and believe in democracy. And going back to that point, and that politicians work for the people that elect them. And I think we need to just always keep that in mind. And what that means in practice is by reaching people in the public square, connecting to them over social media with messages that humanize us rather than dehumanize us, by bringing people together to work on projects together. We have something called the 3142 program, and that stands for the number of counties in America, where we are county by county beginning to set up task forces for people with diverse backgrounds to come together and problem solve together.
I love that, Summer. Thank you so much. And I see some great resources put into the chat on Pledge to Listen and the 7 steps to sustainable peace. There was also a request for some more information on, Christy, what you shared on home rule. Let me go to Dee and Christy with a question that connects with sort of the broader framing of this conversation. Then we'll move to our last question of the session. If this is from Sarah, if we assume that people really are choosing to live where they want, and that people living in rural places really have different preferences from those living in urban places, is the urban-rural divide a problem? Is there a way to increase respect and ensure resources get to the right places without necessarily closing a divide? Christy or Dee, any reactions to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I think there are differences that we should appreciate. And I think we sort of started, I think, Joe, you had mentioned that sort of at the front end, which is seeing our differences as a strength. So a divide doesn't have to, or differences don't necessarily have to be a divide. And if there are some specific preferences around, there are very urban and very rural places are different, right? They just are. And to some, it doesn't mean that our core values are different. It doesn't mean that we can't sort of respect the preferences or you know, the differences that may exist between urban and rural places. Where it becomes a problem is where those differences then translate into underinvestment, that translate into disrespect, that translate into not being able to see sort of each other, you know, whether it's sort of for each other's true humanity, or even, you know, in a lot of the work that I'm doing, thinking about economic development and prosperity and growth from that perspective, thinking about what are the contributions and respecting the contributions that both parts of regions have for each other. So no, it doesn't necessarily need to be that divides are something that don't exist. I think we can talk about them in terms of differences to be a little bit more productive, but also understanding that there are sort of underlying core values that I think we have that we also need to bring to the conversation.
And I agree with that.
So let me turn to you, Dee, to kick off a response to my final question for the three of you. We've talked a little bit during this conversation about the perceptions and misperceptions. Summer, you use the word other, talking not just about people who live in different types of communities, but people who are different from us, look different from us, have different skin color, and so on. Dee, you talked about the fact that we often underappreciate the diversity in rural communities, recognizing that 20+% are people of color, for example. So my question is, what concrete steps can people who are listening to this conversation take to combat the misperceptions of people in different types of communities and the perceptions of just those communities themselves? What can we do to transcend some of the differences that can potentially divide us, but as Christy has emphasized, can unite us instead, and as Summer has described, move us towards sustainable peace? Let's go to you first, Dee. We'll go to Christy, then we'll go to Summer.
I was just watching this film, this documentary, Our Towns, about Deb and James Fallows looking at different towns around the country, different sizes. And one of the things they said was whenever they went to a town and started talking about the political differences, then they lost the moment, you know, that everybody quickly retreated to their camps. But if they could make the conversation about some communitarian effort where people were pitching in and working together, then they had the chance to create some mutual purpose. And I think that that's what we have to do, is we have to get to some purposeful imagining, that we have to get to a place where we're suspending our disbelief about each other and beginning to find that common purpose. There's practical ways to do it, but I think first of all, we got to search ourselves and see if what we're bringing to the conversation.
Love that, Dee. Thank you. Christy?
Yeah, I'll say, I think again, coming at this from the perspective of, how do we move forward, really? How do sort of places that have been disinvested in, that have had sort of a challenging 30 years plus, move forward? And I think that requires all of us sort of coming together, and it requires, like I said before, sort of peeling back that narrative of urban-rural divide. I think if we start uplifting the stories about what it means for regional economies to operate in an effective way, we're going to start finding greater equity. We're going to start finding more growth, and we're going to start finding more opportunities for places that are not only urban, and that the strategies therefore wouldn't just encourage people to move to urban, but if we're truly thinking about an integrated regional economy, that means reinvesting in urban communities and also sort of appreciating and valuing the contributions, the necessary contributions that they are also making to their regional economies. So again, one solution, peeling back the narrative around negative urban-rural divide, uplifting the stories about what actually works and what regional economies are actually consist of, as opposed to just perpetuating the stories around urban-rural divide, particularly when it comes to economic development.
Thanks, Christy. Final thoughts from you, Summer?
Yeah, three things, actually. I would say, one, I'd encourage everybody on this call to make a 60-second or 90-second video that touches on one of the following topics. What does it mean to belong in America? What do you think it means to belong in America today? What do you think our common purpose that Dee keeps encouraging us to think about is? And what's your vision for unity in America? What is that? What do we need to do to get there, in your opinion? And then post it. Post it on the public square, and tag us, tag all of us, and we'll repost it. And that is going to actually get a conversation started. I guarantee you it'll get an interesting conversation started, which will probably lead in a positive direction. The second is, I'd love to invite everybody to be a listening facilitator and come to into the Millions of Conversations Network. We'd love to have you, and to work together on building that out. And then third, the summertime's coming up, Memorial Day's around the corner. This summer, if you can, and if you have the time and can afford it, if you live in a city, go and spend a weekend in a rural area and connect in with the community. And if you live in a rural area, come on into the city and spend a weekend, not just come in to have dinner, but try to spend 2 or 3 days. And again, make a video about it and post it.
I accept all three challenges, Summer, and I encourage all of our attendees to accept them as well. Please join me. I want to thank Summer, Dee, Christy for a great, insightful conversation. I'd like to thank SNF Agora for hosting this timely and important conversation. Let me turn it back over to Hari Han, the inaugural director of SNF Agora. Thanks, Hari. Over to you.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you, Christy, Dee, and Summer for being with us today. It was just a really terrific conversation. And Joe, thank you for facilitating everyone through a really interesting set of questions and thoughts. I also want to thank the audience for being with us today and making such thoughtful contributions. For those of you who are from Maryland, if this conversation energized you to find ways to engage more deeply with fellow Marylanders outside your own rural or urban comfort zone, we encourage you to consider participating in a new project that Urban Rural Action and the SNF Agora Institute have just launched called Uniting for Action on the Maryland Economy. It's a 12-month nonpartisan initiative that will bring people together to understand different perspectives on the state's economic needs, build relationships, strengthen collaboration skills, and work together to address shared economic challenges. So if you're interested in joining the cohort, just click on the link that we'll be putting in the chat now to learn more or apply to participate. And if you'd like to stay in touch and learn about our upcoming events this summer, along with our news about the SNF Agora research and programming, we welcome you to sign up for our newsletter by clicking on the other link in the chat. So finally, a recording from today's conversation will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel. We really thank you all for joining us today. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.